Good morning, everybody. We are so excited to have you here with us today. I wanted to welcome to you all to the NAPC latest webinar. This one's on early 20th century architecture, looking to the past and the future. I'm Michael Hauser, and I'm the state architectural historian for the Washington State Historic Preservation Office. I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'll be monitoring the chat, monitoring the Q&A, and kind of answering things as needed. I'd like to take a few moments to get everybody a little bit familiar with this webinar platform. This is different than Zoom. It's called Big Marker. And like other platforms, you do have access to the Q&A and the chat. There's actually a polling function, which are tabs that are on the top right-hand side of your screen. If you'd like to minimize those, you can click on the downward arrow in the upper right corner of your screen. That'll get rid of those. To bring them back up, there's a little blue chat button at the bottom right corner. If you click that, it'll bring those back up. Today's presentation will be in full screen mode. If you want to view the presentation in full screen mode, you just hover over the presentation and click full. So it's pretty easy, pretty self-explanatory. If you're having any technical issues, just use the private chat function up at the top, and that'll send you to Marie, who's kind of behind the scenes. She'll be managing. She works for NAPC. She'll be figuring out those details. This session is being recorded today, and it's available for on-demand viewing afterwards. If you have to leave or if you want to share it with somebody else, that'd be great. As a registrant, you will automatically be receiving access to the recording just a few hours after the session is completed today. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. As you can see, there are some continuing education credits that will be listed on the opening slide. You can find these instructions repeated throughout the presentation in the chat. So if you need those, be sure to follow those. We also invite you definitely to ask questions in the webinar. We're here to answer your questions. You'll get some, we'll get to those questions probably at the end as time allows. So use the Q&A function, not the chat function for the questions. If somebody asks a question you'd like to hear the answer to, this is kind of a cool thing about Big Marker is if you give the thumbs up, it basically rises those questions to the top of the list. So if we have more people that are interested in the answers to those will float to the top for us, kind of an upvote, if you will. National Alliance for Preservation Commissions is committed to providing a welcoming space and encourages collaboration, discussion, of course, the sharing of ideas and different points of view. There's a couple of things to note, though, following code of conduct, if you will. Please exercise consideration and respect towards the presenters, with our participants, with your speech and your actions. Attempt to collaborate before you go into the conflict mode. Refrain from demeaning, discriminatory, and harassing behavior and speech. And of course, be mindful of your surroundings and your fellow participants as well. I am super excited to introduce today's presenter, Abby Christman. Abby is actually the principal planner for the landmarks preservation at the city and the county of Denver in Colorado. She has a varied background, working for consulting firms, Preservation Colorado, which is the statewide nonprofit, the University of Colorado, also in Denver. Her experience is just a breadth of a variety of things. She does 106 consultations. She's done reconnaissance and intensive level surveys. She's done National Register nominations. She does HABs, Hare and Howes documentation. She's done neighborhood pattern books and preservation tax credits, interpretation, public outreach, serving on the Historic Landmarks Denver Commission, you name it, Abby's done it. And she is a fabulous speaker. I think you're going to enjoy what she has to offer today. She also teaches a graduate course in Denver titled Historic Buildings in Context. She holds a BA in history from the University of the South and an MA in public history and historic preservation from Middle Tennessee State, and another MA in histories and theories of architecture from the Association of School of Architecture in London, England. So Abby, we are so glad that you are here and look forward to seeing what you have to offer us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So we have a lot to cover, so let's just jump in. So today we're going to be talking about architecture in the first half of the 20th century. So for organizational purposes, this is how we're going to cover it today. So we're going to have the eclectic styles. So these are really, kind of the variety of revival styles, wide range of styles that pull inspiration from both classical and romantic style influences. We then have the progressive styles, these kind of new emerging styles. We have the prairie style and the arts and crafts. And then we have the emergence of modernism, which we see in Art Deco, Streamline Moderne, Art Moderne, and then we also have the emergence of the international style in this period. So as you can see, there's a lot going on. I think really the early 20th century is one of the most crowded periods of architectural histories where there's so many styles that are popular at the same time, which is really why I find this a particularly interesting period because there's just so much going, so many competing styles that are popular that leads to a real architectural variety and some interesting streetscapes when we're looking at cities and neighborhoods that were being built during this period. So just a couple of disclaimers before we get started. This is not a comprehensive presentation. You may realize, wait, what about this style? She didn't talk about something else. I'm not talking about some styles. We don't have enough time. So this is like the big picture. There will be some styles that I do not get to today. Also, there's a lot of regional variation in style. So I'm in Denver. I've worked in various places across the country, but I am doing this presentation today with a Denver perspective. A lot of my examples will be from Denver. They may not look exactly like your buildings from your community. And just because something that I talk about, key features of a style, doesn't match a building in your community, doesn't mean that may not be the style it is. And it doesn't mean that it's not significant. Again, there's a lot of regional differences and regional variation. And when we talk about style and we talk about what's significant, you really have to evaluate it by what's significant in your local context. Because, what's a Queen Anne in Denver is completely different than what is a Queen Anne in San Francisco. And so you have to take that into account when you're talking about style as well. Okay, so just to set the stage today, why do we care? Why do we care about style? Why are we here talking about style? Style can really tell us a lot about a community's history. It reflects the contemporary culture, the current values, the preferences of those who built the buildings and those who were using it. And it also reflects the economy of a community and technological innovation. So what are some of the key things that were shaping style in the early 20th century? So some of the things I'm going to hit on today, kind of competing trends towards nostalgia as well as modernism. So some looking to the future, some looking to the past, but always wanting the modern comfort. So even if you were having a revival style house built, you still wanted the latest in modern technology. We have a lot of influence of industry and innovation on design, some major reform movements that are impacting design. The emergence of urban planning as a profession happened in this period. Also, real development of print media and improved technology to be able to share printed photos made it a lot easier to share building examples and made these kind of style guides and style catalogs of houses much more accessible. Also, architecture became really tied to identity. There were so many different choices you could make, so many different options you could choose that, you were choosing the one that you felt was, expressing yourself, that was, the type of building, whether you chose a colonial revival or whether or not you chose a bungalow, that became a personal reflection of your own kind of sense of style and values. So what's happening in this time period, early 1900s? So urbanization across the country. By 1920, more than half of Americans were living in cities. So you had industrialization, migration, and immigration all fueling this urban growth. And with that, you also got the beginnings of sprawl as people started to move out into streetcar suburbs, these kind of satellite communities around a lot of central cities. And part of that was to flee urban problems. So with this huge and kind of really rapid urbanization, you had issues with sanitation and housing shortages and poverty. Coming, they hoped to the rescue to deal with some of these problems were the, kind of large, overreaching progressive movement. And members of that progressive movement kind of, it was very broad. So there was, people that were interested in politics and planning, architecture, sociology, public health. So the progressive movement was really this large umbrella that included a lot of different movements, but a lot of these movements aimed at improving standards of life, both for urban and rural communities. So it wanted to, have better working conditions, better living conditions, improved health and safety, and just improved housing. And some of the diverse movements included in this include things like the settlement house movement, City Beautiful, suffrage movement, prohibition, political reforms, and labor reforms. And one of these aspects of the progressive movement that's particularly influential when we're talking about domestic architecture is the home economic movements. So widespread movement, you saw it both in schools as well as in publications and kind of community organizations. So home economics movement really believed that the home environment could really impact both the physical, emotional, and moral well-being of those in the home. And so it promoted home management based on modern principles of efficiency and economics. So really seeing, how you could use science and technology to improve daily life. And it wanted to train homemakers in art and design so that they could, control their domain, efficiently and beautifully furnish their homes, and study all the systems and how they worked, how a house could be more efficient. And it became an interesting part of a debate that was going on really about the role of women in the home. For kind of more the liberal progressives, they really saw that having a more efficient home was great because that meant women could spend more time outside of the home. They didn't have to spend the time homemaking then, so that let them leave the home. Whereas for some of the more conservatives, they also thought that this, increase of women's role in the home was great, but it was so that they could more professionalize this role and that women could be happy in the home and that they could have their own domain and that they would be respected as being homemakers. So as we're looking then into architecture, and particularly today, I'm going to focus a lot on residential architecture. We see a real shift in kind of what the home is from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. So we go from, if you think of something like a sprawling Queen Anne, where there's a lot of specialized spaces, clutter, kind of a lot of knickknacks that was seen as, that was lush, that showed wealth. So you wanted a lot of, frou-frou and a lot of ornate detailing. So really focus on abundance and elaboration and more formality. Whereas in early 20th century housing, it was much more about simplicity, functionality. They wanted the house to be sanitary, but also cozy, to be multi-purpose and more relaxed, and to be healthy with improved ventilation and light. So some of the key trends, do you see that? So real simplification, so eliminating decoration that wasn't either practical or comfortable, promoting a lot of smooth surfaces, things that are easy to clean. It's really interesting. Some of this particularly got emphasized after the flu pandemic in the 19-teens. And certainly we've all gone through kind of a similar experience of looking, how do you have surfaces that you can clean efficiently in your home? Houses also were getting smaller. Part of this was because a larger percentage of cost was going into modern technology, going into efficient, plumbing and heating. Family size was also getting smaller, and fewer families had help in the house as well. Okay, so now let's jump into the styles. So first off, those eclectic revivals. So there were multiple waves of revival styles that emerged from the late 19th century into the 1940s. And they really embraced a wide range of styles, and a lot of them tended to pretty faithfully borrow details from the historical styles, more faithfully than some of the revival styles that were popular during the 19th century. And as America took on a more kind of dominant role in the world as a world power, a lot of it was really seen that these traditional styles, kind of showed this American connection with these great European civilizations, and kind of tried to kind of create a past for the U.S. As this, kind of upstart new country. There were a lot of different architectural responses for different regions, a lot of them relating uniquely to climate and materials and heritage of different regions. But all of them kind of adapted the past, but while still thinking about modern comfort. So you had this nostalgic aesthetic, but with modern amenities. And they could also be more accurate in kind of their depictions of historical styles due to the increased availability of photographs of kind of original buildings, of historic buildings, and kind of spread of things like measure drawings through publications. So when architects were really kind of conceptualizing these eclectic designs, they didn't really, think about one style being better than the other. You didn't have the same arguments that you had like early in the 19th century, where is classical or romantic better? Here, it's more like looking for underlying commonalities in styles and really looking at how they could be adapted to serve modern needs. So really look at universal principles of good design and how you could sensitively and creatively adapt these traditional styles to modern houses or modern commercial needs. So really trying to look for a balance between continuity and change. So initially, these eclectic revivals were used more for high style, really large, architect designed homes. But after World War One, with improved technology, the kind of introduction of being able to do veneers. And so you didn't, if you wanted an elaborate home, it didn't have to all be constructed out of masonry. You could just have that brick veneer. They became more widespread, and you got these styles applied to smaller homes as well. And a lot of these styles were used a lot to kind of provide identity to, for developers, to communities, in particular regions or new developments that were being constructed. So here's kind of a rough timeline to kind of show you, these kind of overlapping time periods of when the styles kind of were popular. So colonial revival really emerges kind of first in the 1880s and extends through this whole time period, remains popular into the 1950s. Then emerging in the 1890s, you have the classical revival, Italian Renaissance, Tudor revival, and then also the Mission revival. Some of those kind of die out by the 20s, others extend on into the 40s. And then a little bit later in the early 20th century, you have the emergence of the Spanish colonial revival, the Pueblo revival, and the French eclectic. So the colonial revival. So it was inspired by the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876. So this was an exhibition designed to celebrate the centennial of 1776. And at this time, people really started looking to the colonial period for design inspiration. So wanted to look to the American past, American heritage. So colonial revival borrows from Georgian, Federal, Greek revival. And a lot of the celebration of American heritage came about as a reaction to all of the immigration that was occurring. So these large waves of immigration, colonial revival became a way to kind of reaffirm traditional American values. And they really had this nostalgia for this colonial past, kind of the life was simpler, less materialistic, and you had these really clear values. And the colonial revival leads to revival of all kind of, related, kind of fields in history and genealogy and decorative arts, as well as architecture. So you've got things like parties where you dressed up in colonial costumes. And all of these colonial revival movements were really kind of celebrating this golden age of American past and heritage, this kind of really romanticized notion of the colonial period. So you get rise of genealogical groups and heritage groups, as well as this kind of interesting idea, and something, that really you could use this architecture and design to shape character. So it kind of goes along with that progressive ideal that, the home conveyed morality, and you could, shape the morality of those who lived in it through the design choices you made. So for the followers of the colonial revival movement, if you wanted to raise children with colonial virtues, honesty, sincerity, strength, courage, you just needed to bring them up in a colonial style home. You could choose something like the Hawthorne there, this dignified home, and colonial revival interior furnishings as well. So colonial revival then plays an important role in the early emergence of historic preservation as well, because there becomes, with this romanticized look to the past, there also becomes this group of philanthropists who are looking at, starting to preserve those items. So both, collections for museums, as well as, preserving buildings. So rescuing, historic houses and restoring them either for themselves or to start converting them into museums. And then the most famous museum complex associated with the colonial revival is Colonial Williamsburg. So John D. Rockefeller purchased properties in Williamsburg in secret. And the restoration eventually encompassed 85% of Williamsburg's original 18th century area, covering around 300 acres. And to recreate, this kind of colonial appearance on those 300 acres, hundreds of buildings constructed after 1790 were demolished and kind of reconstructed in a more, in an earlier style. And early Williamsburg then had a very strong patriotic message really tied to the colonial revival movement. So here you have kind of key features of the colonial revival style. As I said, kind of mixes together influences from both Georgian and Federal. So you get the symmetry, the balance, the use of the pediment, that kind of triangular feature is really predominant, as well as broken pediments. You have elaborate entryways, often with side lights or fan lights, and all kind of carefully balanced with classical detailing. You also get kind of variation on that emerges. The Dutch colonial revival, pretty similar, except it uses the gambrel roof. You also have then the small scale evolution, the Cape Cod type that was popular from 1920s into the 1960s. That's kind of the 1.5 story simplified colonial revival style house. So because the colonial revival movement extends for so long, you really have a huge variety of what's constructed, from more kind of elaborate colonial revival from the 1890s to the colonial revival motel from the 1950s. And houses can also vary widely in the kind of larger scale, more ornate, to more simpler. So following on the heels of the colonial revival was the classical revival movement. So we're going to be talking today about a lot of expositions. There's a lot of fairs and expositions that really kind of kick off interest in styles during this period. And for the classical revival, it was the Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago. So it really kind of conveyed this message that the city didn't have to just be about industry and economy, that it could also be really enhanced through aesthetics, that cities could be a center of arts and culture. And it really changed the way Americans saw the urban landscape, particularly such huge crowds came to Chicago, and then they, came back to their own communities, and they really kind of spread the word and spread this interest and kind of recreating elements of the White City from Chicago in their own communities. So this really leads to the creation of the City Beautiful movement. So it's really a reaction against rapid, haphazard industrial development, really had a goal of efficient and beautiful cities. Really felt that beauty could elevate everyone, that it could kind of raise the moral and civic virtues of your community. So, beauty could be a tool for dealing with corruption and crime and prostitution. You just had to, beautify, and then, you could elevate everyone. And along with kind of creating parks, parkways, beautiful spaces, City Beautiful movement was also doing a lot of practical things like, improved transportation, tenement repairs, and, kind of improved housing, more park space as well. So key features of the City Beautiful movement: a lot of parks with fountains and monuments, classically inspired, kind of balanced buildings, wide boulevards lined with trees, public gathering places, and focus on grand vistas. So some of the key features: formal symmetry. So usually going to have a centered door, very balanced, frequently features a portico with classical columns, sometimes also a temple front. Smooth stone finish is most common, but you can find examples in brick, sometimes wood as well, and a really prominent cornice with dentils. And then you also get both, as far as that residential, you get the really grand scale, the more public buildings too. So classical revival is certainly in the US our most common style that we use for our public buildings, for our courthouses and city halls. So really grand symmetrical plans, often with grand entrances and staircases, and very balanced symmetrical design. So, but not all of the classical revival has to be quite that grand. You can also see some simpler versions. Sometimes instead of columns, you might just use pilasters. Sometimes you might have a more kind of basic house form that just has a grand two-story porch applied. Okay, moving on then through our styles, we get the Renaissance revival that's kind of becoming popular around the same time as the classical revival. It's primarily a style that's used for more architect-designed landmarks, either large-scale commercial or residential buildings. Details are borrowed pretty directly from Italian originals. People are, more able to travel at this point, so they travel and see the original examples. And a lot of that is really seen in the way you have that rusticated first floor, and then kind of lighter above that is, something that's really taken directly from the original Italian examples. So key features. The arches are really key. So round arched openings are one of the really key elements to look for in identifying Renaissance revival. When it comes to houses, things like terracotta tiling is also for roofing is really common. It's going to be balanced, but not always symmetrical. Generally, it's going to have a low, either flat or really low pitched roof, and often kind of get arcades or kind of repeating arch patterns. You see in a grander commercial example, again, that really heavy rusticated first floor. You get the variety of arched openings, kind of arcade feel, different treatments to the different arches on different levels, and then that really prominent cornice at the top. And you can see here, you can have still a fair amount of variety within the Renaissance revival, from the really grand home or commercial or public buildings to some simpler, more small scale examples of Renaissance revival. Okay, so then on to the Tudor revival. So Tudor looked to medieval building traditions instead. So it's looking to medieval building traditions of England. You also get similar stylistic features in northern France. And so really looking there instead of the classical influence that we've seen in some of the other revivals. So it was a very romantic style, looking tied to that kind of romantic movement in art and architecture. In the early 20th century, it was really popular for some of the houses being developed in these kind of new streetcar suburbs. And it was really grand kind of before World War I, and then there were more modest examples built after World War I. So key features there. Really the key feature to look for is the kind of wood and stucco that's being applied to mimic post and beam construction. So obviously these modern examples don't have the same post and beam construction as the late medieval originals, but they want to, kind of imitate that. You also get really steeply pitched roofs with cross gables, some arched openings. You often get kind of casement windows, sometimes with diamond pane designs, and you also get kind of decorative brickwork, decorative stonework as well. Then on a smaller scale, you have the development of the English Norman cottage. So it's kind of the mini-me of the Tudor. So this is just going to be single story, smaller, more modest, but it's going to use some of the same design features. So it may use some of that decorative half timbering, as you see on the example there at the top. And it may, it's also going to include things like sometimes arched openings, decorative brickwork, the steeply pitched roof, and cross gables as well. And the English cottage was popular more kind of the end of this is, the post-World War I period from the 1920s into the 1940s. So example there, so you get that still really steeply pitched roof, the really prominent chimney, and some of that decorative brickwork. So just to see, kind of a whole range there from the larger scale, kind of grander Tudors to the small scale. And then also there's kind of an offshoot in there, the storybook cottage as well, that you see at the bottom corner there, the kind of really fanciful versions of the English cottage, the kind of really Hollywood take on the fairy tale cottage that was also popular during this period. Okay. So we plow on through this architectural tour. We also then have the Mission Revival. So the Mission Revival is really interesting in that for the first time, it's a style that's really looking to the heritage of the West Coast. So many of our architectural styles in the US have, developed on the East Coast. And this one originates in California. So while the East Coast was looking back to its colonial past with the colonial revival style, in California, they turned to their colonial past and Hispanic heritage for inspiration. So Mission Revival, influenced by the Franciscan missions that have been scattered across California and other areas of the Southwest. So really well-suited style for the warmer climate, and sometimes in some of its detail also overlaps sometimes with some of the craftsmen, which we'll talk about a little later. So it's another one that kind of owes some of its popularity to an exposition. In this case, the same exposition that started the classical revival. So at the Columbian Exposition in 1893, while most of the buildings were in the classical revival style, the California State Building was done with a mission influence. So you can see things like that big open arcade, the shaped parapets, the towers. And so it's this building that really kicks off for California, this mission revival style. And this is spread then through the adoption of this style by the Santa Fe Railway, which decides to kind of do all of its stations in this style as kind of a form of regional branding. And so this really kind of helps then spread the popularity of the style. So really the key thing to look for when you're trying to identify Mission Revival is the use of the shaped parapet. So that's something that's the really key feature that can help you identify Mission Revival. You're also looking for smooth wall surfaces, often the use of tile roofing, arcades, and arches as well. And you can see here kind of a wide variety from more elaborate mission revival to some pretty simple mission revival that kind of have that simple shaped parapet, but not a lot of other detailing. Okay, so further kind of evolution, then we get to the Spanish colonial revival. So this is also a revival that starts on the West Coast. But unlike the Mission Revival, which was looking directly to kind of the heritage in California and the Southwest and looking directly at missions, the Spanish colonial revival looks more broadly at kind of all of the Spanish colonies and all of Spanish architecture. And it incorporates architecture, from Spain and Mexico, as well as from, Gothic and Moorish and Byzantine and Renaissance and, Mediterranean. So it's kind of this really broad, kind of sweep of architectural, kind of Spanish related and Spanish colonial architecturally derived styles. So it's most common in California, the Southwest, and then also very popular in Florida. So basically the areas that had these kind of ties historically to Spain. And it's kind of based on this romantic notion of California as kind of the new Spain of North America. And it also got its start in an exposition. So the Panama, California exposition in San Diego in 1915. Really grand collection of kind of the Spanish influenced style. And so that kind of kickstarts kind of the growth there of the Spanish colonial. So key features can be symmetrical or asymmetrical. Generally is going to be stuccoed, going to have a tile roof, low pitch tile roof. May include some various kind of ornate decorative detailing, particularly as you see at the doorway here. Often is going to have balconies and often going to include wrought iron detailing as well. And there you just see some of that kind of variety of the different approaches, from the grander, kind of more sprawling home to the, kind of small, compact Spanish colonial. Okay, staying kind of in that same region of the country in the Southwest, then we also get the Pueblo revival. Really originated in the 19-teens, and in some areas in New Mexico is still going strong. So never completely died out. So the Pueblo revival looked to the Native American heritage of the Southwest, as well as Spanish colonial buildings for inspiration. Originated in New Mexico. And was really part of that idea of kind of trying to create a recognizable image for New Mexico. So when the economy was struggling in the 19-teens, the planning board decided to kind of do some reconstructions of the city in the Pueblo revival style to encourage tourism, to kind of create this image, branding. And then in 1957, there was historical zoning ordinance that put this into law, that all future buildings in Santa Fe would adhere to these kind of same kind of historic vernacular idioms and materials that you see in the Pueblo revival. As one of the really key kind of grand early examples, the La Fonda Hotel in the Pueblo revival style. Fabulous place to stay if you're ever in Santa Fe. So key features of the style, really, that it's trying to look like it's constructed of adobe. So you're going to get the stuccoed walls, often with rounded corners, really deep set openings, flat roofs, decorative vigas to kind of imitate the original roof structure, where vigas were part of the roof supports. And then often kind of may incorporate other Spanish colonial influences, such as here, adding some of that tile roofing in. So wide range of examples here, from some early historic examples to you can still, there's your Pueblo revival McDonald's, so still being constructed today. Okay, and then to wrap up our kind of a tour of eclectic styles, I'm going to talk then about the French eclectic. So this is really inspired by kind of centuries of French domestic architecture. Became particularly popular after World War I with all the servicemen who had served in the army in France and been across the countryside and kind of seen this French domestic architecture and brought that back to the US. So you can have quite a bit of variety in the form, but the thing that really unifies it all is a really prominent, steeply pitched, large, hipped roof. So looking for that really distinctive hipped roof form is what really can help you identify that French eclectic style. So you see here a really steeply pitched, prominent roof, sometimes combined with things like flared eaves. You get casement windows, sometimes dormers. And you see here, kind of have a variety from some simpler examples to some grander that incorporate turrets and other decorative elements as well. Okay, you survived that speedy wild tour through all of the kind of eclectic revival styles, and now we're going to move on to progressive architecture. So, progressive architecture, taking its name from the progressive movement at the time, really shaped by that larger movement. Those in the progressive movement really objected to the really extravagant displays of wealth that you saw in some of the other styles, like the really grand Renaissance revival or classical, and they wanted a simpler, more honest style. They also wanted to incorporate modern technology and innovation while still connecting with kind of familiar traditions. So they're kind of looking for simplified and abstracted traditional forms, wanted to have an unpretentious design, really emphasize individuality, honesty, democracy, family values, and integration with nature. So our first progressive style, the prairie style, really originated around 1900, popular till around 1920. So originated in Chicago area and popular kind of in that Midwest area, and really designed to complement the terrain of the Midwestern prairies. So it's often sometimes referred to as the first really original American style. Emphasize strong horizontal lines and interaction with the surrounding landscapes. You also often see that with kind of large projections and overhangs and patios that kind of tie into the landscape. Opened up interior spaces to create a more natural flow between rooms, and incorporated a lot of long bands of windows to allow in ample light and cross ventilation. Frank Lloyd Wright is the one who's really associated with the style, but there are also many other notable architects who worked in the style in the Midwest. So style really originates with Frank Lloyd Wright and Oak Park. So Frank Lloyd Wright really starts out designing in what we kind of a mismatch of kind of some Queen Anne, you can see some Tudor revival influences there in some of these buildings. So these are all houses he built in Oak Park, and you can really kind of see that over time, then they really kind of evolve from that kind of Queen Anne Tudor revival style into what becomes then the prairie style. So here's kind of his plan. You can see this was featured in Ladies Home Journal, his ideal for kind of what this ideal house was. That was going to be more streamlined, simple, practical, and wasn't going to have anything extraneous, and was going to be, well organized. And he really used the fireplace as kind of the central hearth. And so kind of the house, it was in the middle, and the house all was kind of oriented around that fireplace. So key features, you get that really kind of boxy massing with horizontal influence, a shallow pitched roof, really deep projecting eaves, the long, narrow bands of windows, and then tying into the local landscape with porches and patios. And you can see quite a bit of variety there. The really large scale prairie style that are much more sprawling, to kind of the smaller, more petite prairie style. And then originating, kind of developing at the same time as the Foursquare. So it's basically, named because it's square. So it's basically a cube form with a pyramidal or hipped roof, and each floor tends to be divided into four. 4 rooms on the first floor, 4 on the second floor, and then you often have may have a livable attic space above as well. It's often kind of considered to be connected to the prairie style or be kind of a vernacular version of the prairie style. But it's a pretty adaptable style because it's really more of a form than a style, because it's a form that you can put a lot of different stylistic elements onto. So you can have some example like you see there at the bottom that is a Foursquare that has a really strong prairie influence. But you can also have a Foursquare like you see at the top there that has classical influence. So it was a pretty adaptable form that you could put different stylistic elements onto. And it was a style that's particularly popular in the Midwest. In some parts of the Midwest, they call it the corn cube. It's all the corn growing states. In Denver, we just call it the Denver Square because it's so popular in Denver. So here you see one of our Denver streets of Denver squares. So key features, that really boxy form. It's going to have that hipped roof with deep eaves, often has a dormer on the end, and then going to have that large porch, low pitch hipped roof porch on the front. And you can see here some different examples then of, kind of applying more kind of a craftsman character or a colonial revival character, or applying some kind of Spanish colonial elements. So it's a really adaptable type that can have different stylistic elements applied. Okay, then on to the arts and crafts movement, our other big style of the progressive category of this period. So the arts and crafts movement is really broad. It's much broader than just architecture. So when it originates in England, it's really a labor movement and a social reform movement, kind of a utopian movement. It's also decorative arts movement. It's a furniture type. It's design philosophy, can be a whole lifestyle, as well as being an architectural style. So it originated mid-19th century in England, and it was really a reaction against industrialization and the poor quality of mass-produced goods. So it really wanted to celebrate craft, and it wanted to celebrate the craftsperson as an artist and kind of elevate that so that craft was equal to arts. And it looked back to the kind of medieval past of craft guilds, where you really respected the craftsman, and you believed that handmade objects had a lot of value, and that they were each going to be individual and a little irregular because they reflected the person that made them versus mass production of goods. Also has some ties in its look to the medieval past, kind of the Gothic revival and the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, as well as other reform movements. So William Morris is really credited as being one of its founders. In addition to being a designer, he is also a prominent socialist, poet, and preservationist. So in England, the arts and crafts movement had a lot of ties to their early historic preservation movement, because William Morris was the founder of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, their first real preservation organization in 1877. Because as they were looking to the medieval past for inspiration, they also then started really advocating for the protection and preservation of those medieval buildings. So Morris established Morris and Company in 1861 to kind of put his reform ideas into practice and to be able to hire craftsmen to produce well-constructed goods. And he produced handmade textiles, wallpaper, stained glass, and furniture. So the goal was really to kind of celebrate the role of the craftsman, restore dignity, elevate craft, restore creativity, and replace the really kind of ornate, busy Victorian aesthetics with a more rational, simpler, kind of streamlined, clean design. And to really make art and beauty integral with life. So kind of those same things that we talked about with the general progressive movement and the home ec movement in the US. So I really felt that design had the capability of improving society. So some examples of some arts and crafts products. So the U.S. Has several kind of proponents that are aware of what's going on in England and try to bring that over to the U.S. One of the main ones was Gustav Stickley. So he was a designer, publisher, and social critic, and he really helped popularize the arts and crafts in the U.S. He founded the Craftsman magazine. He founded a furniture company, still around if you want to buy, Craftsman Stickley designed furniture. And yes, totally pricey. And he had a very functional approach to design. So wanted these kind of clean line, unornamented. And he also really emphasized, the idea of elevating the craftsman, and advocated for rational, unified design in domestic architecture. However, in the US, this didn't quite take. In the US, we really kind of borrow the aesthetic and we ditch the kind of labor, social, craft part. We really like the look of, we like the look of craftsman designed furniture, but we don't want to pay that much money. And so we decide mass production is fine. We want the look of craftsman architecture and craftsman interior design elements, but we'll just make it by machine because that makes it more accessible to everyone, which was always one of Morris's problems in England, that by trying to celebrate the craftsman, it was then only so expensive that only the elite could kind of afford these handcrafted items. So in the US, it becomes much more widespread and popular, but also loses that kind of craft element and a lot of its idealism. And since we don't have really a medieval tradition in the US, it also looked at other kind of design traditions. So it includes design traditions like log cabins, Spanish missions, Native American dwellings. You also get some Japanese influence as well in the arts and crafts movement in the US. But it did continue to emphasize simplicity, natural materials, and architecture that was really tied to its place. So you have here both the kind of like grand architecture, which we tend to call arts and crafts in the US, and then you also have simpler, which we tend to call craftsmen. So the arts and crafts, think about the really grand, sprawling buildings of like Green and Green in California. So really sprawling, lots of porches really tied to the earth, using a lot of wood and natural products, and kind of characterized by these really deeply overhanging eaves with exposed rafter tails. And then we have, and so with some of those kind of features, you have, again, that kind of asymmetry, these really kind of sprawling low-pitched roof forms, kind of these indoor-outdoor spaces with a lot of these porches, and a lot of emphasis on handcrafted. So still kind of continuing that original kind of arts and crafts tradition from England. But then we get the kind of craftsman that gets combined with the kind of simpler house and gets combined with the bungalow. Bungalow is really a form, but it's a form that gets really kind of connected to the arts and crafts movement. And a lot of bungalows we also often call craftsmen, of that kind of a simpler house that's kind of associated with some of those arts and crafts features. But the term bungalow has been used a lot of different ways. I think today we use it most commonly to be, a type of house that's simple, maybe have craftsman features, one story with a porch. But in some periods, it was used to kind of describe any small house. So by some definitions, a bungalow is kind of like any efficient small house with an open interior from the first half of the 20th century. Sometimes it's also used to describe kind of more vacation architecture or coastal, things like a beach bungalow, or you're going to live in, bungalow court for tourists. So the word comes from the word bangla, from the British and India. So this kind of bangla was a small thatched hut for wayfarers, and the British adapted that into a kind of form that was going to have this, kind of adapted to the climate, that was going to be open for good ventilation, kind of thatched with these really low overhanging roofs. And the bungalow as a type really gets spread through the US through pattern books and mail order catalogs. So some of those key bungalow features, it's going to be 1 or 1.5 stories. Dormers are common, low to medium pitched roof with exposed rafter tails. Have an open floor plan that maximized efficiency and flow from room to room. So things like having that opening up, have your dining room and your living room flow into each other. Central fireplaces, usually it has a large front porch that creates an additional outdoor room, and often has a lot of built-ins to kind of maximize kind of efficient use of a smaller space. And the wall treatments can really vary because that's one of those things that really varies from region to region. So kind of see here what is a typical bungalow for us in Denver. But as I said, like bungalows can really vary. So you kind of have that boxy massing, 1.5 stories, that big front porch, and that low pitch and the exposed rafter tails. And you can see that really varies regionally. In California, they tend to be really low pitched roof, kind of more horizontal emphasis. Midwest, they tend to be brick, often with more enclosed porches. And so you see really different regions using different local materials and a lot of variety in bungalows. Okay, now finally, you made it to our last style, the emergence of modern architecture in this period. So modern architecture really starts to emerge in the 1920s. At this point, we talked about urbanization. The majority of Americans are now living in cities, an increasingly rapid pace of change, especially in science and engineering. And with this, some people are really searching for new forms. They want new architecture that embodies this new modern age in the 20s. And so they really start experimenting with building materials and what buildings can be. So you get streamlining develops in this period. So this real obsession with speed and efficiency, trying to eliminate wind resistance, and emphasizes these curved forms, horizontal lines, and nautical elements, which I just always think it's so funny that streamlining, gets applied to architecture when, there's no reason, these buildings aren't going anywhere, but it still looks cool. This is also the period where you get the growth of industrial design as a profession. So kind of combining engineering with aesthetics, finding ways to manufacture products more economically, and encouraging consumption by having these new, more appealing designs and designs that, can kind of more rapidly change. You didn't just have, this is a radio. Instead, this is a streamlined radio, and maybe a new design of a radio is going to come out in a few years, and then another new design. And so this real kind of evolution of the design field with industrial design. So you have a lot of people thinking in this period about what a house should be and what the house of the future is going to look like. And there's kind of a lot of, kind of philosophizing or early kind of debates and experimentation with what a modern house could be. The growth of kind of modern styles, again, go back to another exposition, and at this point, one in Paris. In 1925, that's really credited with starting the Art Deco movement. So it was seen that this really showed that a new decorative style without a reliance on traditional forms could, arise. So it really emphasized smooth geometric architecture with machine-made surfaces. So Art Deco really explored visual perception and ephemeral special effects. So I think if you really think of Art Deco, we often tie it to Hollywood, kind of it's all that glamour, that golden age of Hollywood. It's also kind of the golden age of Art Deco. And so really thinking about Art Deco as one that, likes those kind of special effects. It's not worried about honesty in materials the way Craftsman wanted to be. Instead, it's all about how do we use color and texture and light to kind of create these cool visual effects. It's pretty rare for houses. You see it some. It's more incorporated into commercial and particularly things like theatrical buildings, and often incorporates exotic influences into the designs as well. So cities really use Art Deco, particularly Art Deco skyscrapers, to kind of boost the image. This is a way to really say we are a new modern city. So great example of that, someplace like Rockefeller Center in New York City. We get then a lot of these grand theaters in the Art Deco style. So key features. Art Deco, very vertically oriented. So you see a lot of vertical lines, vertically oriented windows, stepped parapets. You often get decorated spandrel panels that are often kind of low relief. You often get terracotta decoration. So it's going to be very sharp edged, kind of vertical and linear. So I think what a lot of us think about when we think of that, we think of kind of like the colorful Art Deco in Miami. But there's also a lot of Art Deco in government buildings as well. When we think of everything being built during the Great Depression by the Works Progress Administration and the PWA as well. And they did a lot of work in Art Deco. And so we kind of get this, a little bit more subdued, some government versions of Deco design. And this is the one where I included this to give you, I talked at the beginning that don't think just because something doesn't match the kind of like national image of a style that what you have isn't important. There's a lot of different variation. So Art Deco and Art Moderne are two that we really see a huge variation in Denver because Denver loved brick. So it didn't matter that this was a style that was being done mainly in stucco in the rest of the country. Denver still built it in brick. And so, Art Deco looks, fairly different than a lot of the kind of standard Deco, but it's still significant. It's our version of Art Deco. So then you have Art Moderne. So really influenced in design by the popularity of streamlining in industrial production. So really emphasize the curving forms, horizontal lines, nautical elements, and used for both commercial and domestic architecture. So the way to really, define the two and keep them separate is that, Art Deco is all about the vertical and the angular, and that Art Moderne is about the horizontal and the curves. So with Art Moderne, you get a real horizontal influence. You get these kind of horizontal bands of windows that often wrap around curved corners. You have flat roofs rather than the stepped parapets. And you often have metal canopies or other kind of banding that really adds to that horizontal emphasis as well. So it's used a lot for transportation architecture, that again, the streamlining has that association with speed. So, you get a lot of things like gas stations and bus stations constructed in the Art Moderne style. You also get houses then in the Art Moderne style. And then again here, just another example, kind of nationally Art Moderne often features things like a lot of enameled panels, Art Deco. Again, we still do it in brick because in Denver, we really like our brick. So just, example of some of those regional differences. Also, there is often overlap between the two styles. While they are separate and you can find, good examples of both individually, you do often find them combined as well. So, and that same goes for everything I talked about today. Architects often combine elements of styles. Homeowners often are like, well, I like this and I like that. Again, it doesn't mean it's less significant for the fact that it combined multiple elements. Something doesn't have to be a pure example of a style to be important. It's all about how the stylistic elements kind of reflect the time period and reflect the interest and reflect different design trends. So don't think that just because, for these examples, you've combined curved corners with a vertical emphasis and a stepped parapet and horizontal banding, that doesn't make these any less significant. They're just a little, more unique interpretations. Okay, so then finally today, talking about the international style. So we have rose in the 1920s, really came to the US in the 1930s. So it's very kind of avant-garde architect design. We don't see a lot of examples in the US from this period outside of kind of the elites of the West Coast and the East Coast. So it wasn't one in this kind of early iteration that got to the middle of the country too much. It was brought by architects from Europe who were kind of fleeing kind of coming war and chaos. And then they brought with them, kind of their experience of architectural design as well as their work of exploiting modern materials and technology. So a lot of the international style used a thin structural skeleton that could just be covered with a non-structural skin. So you didn't have to worry, it gave you a lot more flexibility in where things were going to be, window placement design, because you had this steel, you just have this kind of steel framework, and then apply a thin kind of, skin around it. So it really emphasized functionality and promoted as being the house as being a machine for living. So the name International Style comes from the Museum of Modern Art, which had an exhibit in 1932, the International Exhibition of Modern Architecture. So the exhibition was really just that it was showing international examples of this style, this kind of current contemporary style from around the world, but it took then international, that just became the name for the style in the US. So this exhibit really emphasized 3 characteristics of what the architecture needed to be. It should be regular and balanced without symmetry, should not have any applied ornament, and that the architecture should emphasize volume over mass, with thin surface materials giving buildings a lighter appearance. So key features. So again, this is a Denver example of a international style. So probably you wouldn't see the brick elsewhere, but for us, this is our international. So has minimal decoration, flat roof, large plate glass windows that are set flush with the wall, broad expanses of flat wall with no windows, because it was very much, it was meant to be a practical, again, machine for living. So it was, you looked at how the interior was going to function and then you arranged your windows and stuff. So they really reflected the interior use rather than trying to create some kind of exterior sense of balance. And then you also have the international style applied to office buildings. So you get that kind of uniform curtain wall draped over a steel frame that leads to these kind of very regular bands of windows on the international style offices. So as I mentioned, just to wrap up then, this was really a period of planning for the future. So during the 30s, there wasn't a lot of new construction because of the Great Depression, and then, kind of halt in new construction in the early 40s because of World War II. But you did still have a lot of discussion about what housing could be and what it was going to be in the future. And a lot of people kind of theorizing, experimenting, kind of having these great visions for what they would see after the Depression, after the war. So one of those people, kind of theorizing the new form of housing, we get back to Frank Lloyd Wright again, who developed the Usonian in the 1930s. So he really saw this as a democratic style for the masses. He was trying to develop a more affordable home, though Usonians as built by Wright still weren't really affordable. But it was a small one-story structure set on a concrete slab with radiant heating, designed to really be economically constructed and energy efficient, have an open plan with connected living and dining areas, and to blend with the outdoor kind of surroundings through indoor-outdoor spaces. So some of that may kind of sound familiar. A lot of these elements then get incorporated to what becomes the ranch style and the contemporary or mid-century modern styles in the post-war period. So he really had 3 kind of requirements for what he considered, modern housing, or his key for his Usonian. You needed to have a transparent wall of glass to connect a living area with a small enclosed garden to kind of have that indoor-outdoor space. He then replaced the fireplace that was at the center of his prairie-style house with a kitchen. And so the kitchen becomes the core, the focal point of the house. And then also for practicality, you needed a carport to include your automobile. And that kind of emphasis on transport also can be seen in Frank Lloyd Wright's work on Broadacre City, also in that period in the 30s, where people are just kind of theorizing what might be in the future. And this was his model of the city of the future, that it was going to be much more sprawling, that everyone would kind of have their acre to live on, and that you kind of have these nodes, city nodes that you might go into, but we would live in this kind of much more sprawling kind of development, and that rely on the car or other sources of transportation to get into the city. So here's some examples of some of the Usonian houses. And then I'm just going to wrap up with the World's Fair. So that really kind of, takes us up to the end of this period. And the fair is, in 1939, is really promoting kind of modern architecture. And it gives us some ideas of where modern architecture is going to go after the war. So trying to make it a little bit more accessible, more for the masses. So a lot of emphasis on product consumption, industrial design, and, kind of creating, elements, not quite so much the stark international, but elements of kind of what we see as the popular mid-century modern, and making modernism a little bit more fun that we see after the war. And that is it. You have made it through, 40 years of architecture there, and a whole lot of architectural styles. So I threw a lot at you. You do have the slides available. So if you want to have these for reference, I know I went through a lot. Happy to take questions, happy to take comments. If anyone in the chat, if you want to tell us what your favorite style is, or if you want to let us know if there's any, I've done several of these style webinars now, so let us know if there's anything else, any other style information you'd like me to talk about. And I'd be happy to plan a future webinar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Abby. It's such a great overview, and there's so much to know. It's you can almost do a lecture on an individual style, and talk about it for an hour. We had lots of questions. I've been diligently answering the easy ones, and I thought I'd save the hard ones for you. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions then. There was a lot of questions regarding eclecticism and sort of the use of styles and finding key elements on buildings, and does that make it a certain style? Can you address the whole idea of that eclectic sort of nature?
I mean, really eclectic by definition, it's like grabbing from different sources. And so while we do find some that really, look to one example, we do certainly find a lot that are a mishmash too. So it can be a hard one to sometimes define. There's definitely ones that have come forward in Denver. People have been, wanting to, nominate something for designation, and we've looked at it and we haven't been able to get beyond eclectic. It's like, well, okay, the porch is colonial revival. Yeah. That's really kind of mission, but and we're like, so if there's one element that's kind of predominant, I would go with, it's French eclectic, if it has that really, dominant hipped roof. If something has a shaped parapet, I would go with Mission. If there's something that really dominates, but you do sometimes just have stuff that's eclectic, that just really, kind of combines elements from a lot of different stylistic traditions without really having one predominate.
Yeah. And that's okay. It doesn't have to be like this high style example. The eclecticism is what makes things interesting, right?
Definitely.
Yeah. Huge votes for doing a future lecture series on 60s through the 2000s. Whoa, that could be a fun one. I'd love to be involved in that one myself. Let me ask you about somebody had a question about public housing projects and how they sort of maybe drove some stylistic characteristics. You have any thoughts on that?
Man, it's really interesting. It's not something I've dug into a lot,
Mhm.
but definitely some of the early public housing projects that were being done in the 1930s is during the New Deal period. Looked towards some of the modern styles and influence, and definitely, I think bad reactions to some of the international style public housing that we got in the 50s really led to some of the downfall of both the international style and large scale public housing as a concept.
Yeah,
So yeah, there's a lot there.
for sure. I was thinking about public housing from the post World War II era, 60s and 70s, and those definitely have distinct characteristics. This particular question was about pre World War II stuff, which
Yeah,
I
well, they definitely, I
yeah.
mean, there was a lot of New Deal kind of era stuff. There were things like the Garden Cities had some public housing and trying to kind of make much more livable. But yeah, it's not something I've dug into a lot.
What's the Pamela just asked a question. What's the deal with flat roofs? Why were there flat roofs in snowy, Minnesota?
I mean, they're popular. I don't really know. I mean, there are ways to get around it with snow loads, but yeah, definitely for snowy climates, as somebody, from Denver, the, Tudor Revival fits the climate with a steeply pitched roof a lot better than some of the flat roof styles.
Yeah, I live in a flat roof house here in Washington State, and it's a mess with all the rain. I'm up there all the time cleaning out the drains. Abby, can you tell us a little bit about connections between, or are there connections between the Renaissance revival and the Romanesque style? Thinking about kind of the arches and the tie into that style, is that really being kind of too nitpicky? Are they two separate things? Are they?
I mean, the Romanesque revival was a little bit earlier, but definitely it has in its arches. The round arches is, I think, the thing that's really similar. There's some other features of the Romanesque revival that aren't in the Renaissance, but definitely the round arches is something that really you see in both.
Yeah, yeah. What's the difference, Abby, or is there any difference between art moderne and streamline moderne?
I think they're pretty much the same, just different terminology.
Yeah, yeah. And what's confusing for all of us in the architecture community, right, is you pull up one guidebook and it says this, and you pull another guidebook and it says this, and who is right?
Yeah, there's definitely, with some styles, there's not consistent. In some books it'll be classical revival, some it will be neoclassical. In some books it'll be Spanish colonial revival, and others it'll be Spanish eclectic. So yeah, there are still some debates over, what term we're going to use.
Yeah, yeah. There was a question about sort of the social connection in terms of the moral values that one placed on architecture, in particular with colonial revival. You mentioned sort of the moral values. Do you think there's any other styles that had that impact?
I mean, I think definitely a lot with some of the, bungalow often. I mean, some of that where you really see that kind of moral influence or, emphasis is when you're looking at catalogs. And so I find it really fascinating to read the descriptions and catalogs of how they market the houses, because it's very much like marketing, like, this is who we think this house is going to appeal to. If you want to live this kind of life, this is the house for you. And, kind of really ties those values to style. And you see that a lot in kind of the bungalow as well as the colonial revival or two that you see that a lot in. But it's really interesting if you go back through any of those catalog reproductions to really see the ways that those styles were marketed, through kind of, this is the house for you if you believe this. This is the house for you if you want to live like this. And
Sure.
One of my favorite assignments that I do with my class is assigning them catalog houses, images, and getting them together in groups. And they have to name the catalog house and describe who would want to live in it.
Like what model number it is?
Yeah. So they have to come up with a name, and then they have to write some promotional text.
I'm glad you brought up period catalogs. I put in the chat actually a bunch of links to period catalogs that are out there. I love period catalogs and look at them often to talk about styles and ages and really pinpoint down when things sort of appear and show up in the architectural vocabulary. Abby, what is your go-to style book? What is it?
Definitely McAllister's Field Guide to Houses if I'm looking at residential architecture. And even if I'm not looking at residential, sometimes just her guides to details and what's popular when can be really helpful too. So that one is definitely my go-to.
Yeah, me too. And I heard, even though Virginia McAllister has passed away, she was working on a book for commercial field guide to architecture, and some of her friends are taking up that effort, and hopefully it'll be published in the next couple of years.
Yes, I am so excited
We will look forward
to get
to
a
that.
commercial guide. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's great now with the web. So many also just of those historic catalogs are available. There's some great online sources where you can download all those, Sears catalogs, and you can get other, there were lumber companies that did their own catalogs and government guides to different house styles. And it's, there's some building technology libraries available online where you can download all those, catalogs for reference, which is just really handy.
Yeah. I was thinking about, there's some more questions about sort of this newer period in architecture and where is it going to go, and have we started to define these new post-World War II styles? When you get past the 80s, what is, if anything's left standing by the time it turns 50, what are we going to call these things? Have you ever seen any guidebooks? Have you put any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I've looked some for a presentation I've done. I have looked at some of that, and McAllister makes some suggestions in the updated guide. So there's a couple that I think that are really that we see a lot, at least locally in Denver. The one that she calls decoupage, which is basically how many different, the basic box, but that puts on 4 or 5 different building materials.
Yeah.
And has the stone veneer with the hardy board, with the tile, with the and then another one she calls slightly askew, which is the influenced by mid-century modern, but with just a slightly askew roof, the little askew details. Some of the others, definitely the modern farmhouse is a huge one here. So I think modern farmhouse is definitely coming into terminology.
Thank you, Joanna and Chip Gaines.
Yeah. And then another one we see here, I've heard it referred to like architainer or cargo texture, which is, the houses that are, either actually designed from shipping containers or just designed to look like they are built out of shipping containers.
Just what everybody wants, to live in a shipping container. Yes. Have you, do you guys play around with the term early American up there in Colorado?
Yeah, that's not one that we use a lot. But I mean, for us, the whole thing is we're really only getting revival styles. We don't really have the original, as far as a lot of the revivals, we, just have the colonial revival. We don't have the original colonial. So we don't kind of, dig into some of the early American as much.
Well, actually, the early American, I'm pushing this in Washington State. Early American was really referred to and used a lot in the 1950s and 60s as an architectural aesthetic. So instead of having this huge colonial revival period that dates from X to X, 100 years, to try and break that down, I'm a big splitter.
I really like that. Yeah, because there is definitely a real stylistic difference. Here we just kind of lump it all into colonial revival. But yeah, there's definitely a shift there. I like that. Okay, maybe I'll start using early American.
Yeah. Lots of period publications and real estate advertisements and things like that using that term in the 50s. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know you broached it a little bit here and there, but the difference between styles and forms?
Yeah, sure. So when talking about styles, we're really talking about things where aesthetics are as important as the function. So it's designed kind of to be a work of art. And so, it obviously needs to function, but it's also, aesthetics are very, integral to, the design and the construction. And so usually when we're talking about styles, that tends to be things that are more, architect designed, or, designed by somebody that has some sort of, design training. And styles tend to rise and fall in popularity. They kind of become popular, become less popular. Whereas like with forms and types, it's really about the layout. It's about that a 4-square is a box and it has 2 stories and a hipped roof. A bungalow is single story with a wide porch. And, those basic forms then, you might apply some architectural detailing, that comes from an architectural style. But it's not integral to the whole design necessarily. I mean, it can be. You can have a bungalow that's craftsman, that it is really integral to the design, but you could also have a bungalow that's just a really simple form that doesn't have any of that detailing on it. And so definitely, and we see that a lot then with 4-square, and same thing with some other things. You can just have a hipped roof box. You can have a front gable house. You can have, that are basic forms that are really common, that may or may not have detailing added to them.
Yeah. That's a great explanation. I always like to think of style really as almost applied ornamentation, because you could have a 4-square that's a craftsman version, or a prairie version of a 4-square, or a ranch house that's that has some Tudor elements, or a Western ranch house, or a Spanish ranch house, on and on and on. Oh, Abby, it has been a wonderful discussion with you. I am so excited that you were here today, and such a great overview, and so much more for us to think about and be confused about. But we are all getting there, and we're all learning, still learning. I'm sure I am, as certainly you are, as we dig into the deeper aspects of these. And we're certainly learning about terminology and what we're going to call these new architectural styles that have happened in the last 20, 30 years, right?
The field is always evolving.
That's right. Anything else that you want to add?
No, I think that's it. Thank you all for joining us today. And just, as current vice chair of the NAPC board, thank you so much for being here. And we love doing these webinars, and just let us know what more you would like, what topics you want us to present on.
Absolutely. If we didn't get to your question today, please don't hesitate to reach out to Abby or myself via email. We're always up for questions, and we love style questions too.
Definitely. I love to debate style.
Me too. You can find style, you can find style. Yes, you can find style, but you can find our contact information on the webinar landing page, or go through NAPC as well. We'll continue to offer credits and webinars like these at no cost to NAPC members. So if you're not a member, we certainly encourage you to join, and you can get free access to these sorts of virtual ongoing trainings. We have lots of them. There's so many other great benefits. It's really one of my favorite organizations out there. So please join if you so choose. You can find out information just by logging on to NAPC's website, and look at the handout page as well. Remember, today's attendees of this live session will automatically receive a certificate for completion via email this afternoon. So check that out in your email. If you don't see it by Monday, you can reach out to maybe first check your spam, check your promotions folder, and then reach out to NAPC and see if something went wacky. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and happy holidays to everyone. So nice to have you here.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Abby. Thanks so much.